Hello and welcome to The Edge, where we're taking an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We're bringing not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert perspectives and opinions. So let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. The British government has reported over 88,000 new coronavirus cases, a second consecutive record. Only daily tally as the Omicron coronavirus variant fuels a worrying surge in infections across the country. France says that it will tighten restrictions on travellers arriving from the United Kingdom. The Omicron variant has now been found in at least 77 countries, many reimposing travel restrictions to stem the spread. Will tougher measures stop the spread of Omicron? A new report from the United Nations Food Agency says that nearly 1/3 of the Arab world's population experienced food insecurity in 2020. 69 million in the region were undernourished in 2020 in what the Food and Agriculture Organization say was a 91% increase over the past 2 decades. The United Nations agency said that the spike in undernourishment was observed across all income levels in both conflict-ridden and stable countries. What is the international community doing to provide the necessary assistance? And the double standards of Western nations have directly contributed to the rise of Islamophobia to alarming levels in European countries. While anti-Semitism is considered a crime, people who insult Islam often escape judgment under the guise of freedom of expression. Experts are calling for a distinction between freedom of expression and hate speech against all religions, including Islam, and for laws that criminalize Islamophobia. What measures are needed to stop the rising Islamophobia? And these are the top 3 stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. The heavily mutated COVID Omicron variant, which was recently identified and rapidly labelled a variant of concern by the World Health Organization, is now threatening a tidal wave of infections. Our following infographic has more about this new variant. For the second day in a row, Britain has recorded its highest ever coronavirus figures as the new strain hits the country hard.
The UK registered a record number of daily coronavirus infections for the second day in a row, as the rapid spread of the Omicron variant continues to cause concern across the country. More than 1,690 Omicron cases have been found in Britain, the biggest daily increase since the COVID-19 variant was detected in the country, taking the total Omicron cases found in the country to over 11,000. The latest data came from Susan Hopkins, the UKHSA's chief medical advisor, saying every person infected with the Omicron variant was believed to be passing it on to between 3 to 5 others on average. The aggravation of the pandemic has strained hospital resources across the country, with facilities in many parts of the nation, particularly in the capital, already overwhelmed. England's chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, warned on Thursday that while the symptoms of the Omicron strain were mild, it was more infectious and would infect more people in the short term. He advised people to prioritize events that matter to them in the run-up to Christmas and said the record for daily hospital admissions for COVID could be broken in the coming weeks, urging people not to mix with people they don't have to. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said on the same day that new vaccination clinics would be opened to urge people to get a booster shot. However, he noted there would be no new lockdowns despite fears that the Omicron strain could bring more cases, saying that if people wanted to engage in public activities, they just needed to get a test and be more careful.
And I'm joined live from Bath in England by Dr. Bharat Pankhania, who's a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Dr. Pankhania, thank you so much for joining us here again today on The Edge. Now, as we just heard, the number of Omicron cases in the UK is soaring. The figures just released earlier today estimate that there were 3,200 new cases today, almost double yesterday's. The number of cases has been doubling every 2 days in the last few weeks. And yet, there's talk that that the disease caused by the Omicron variant doesn't cause such severe disease. So is this something that we should be concerned about?
Hello, Andy. Yes. One other bit of information is it has already become the dominant variant in Scotland. So we can see how fast it is progressing and displacing the Delta variant. And should we be concerned? Absolutely. We don't know. We don't know for sure that it will be mild disease causing in a older European population compared to the South African much younger population. Right. So of course we should be very concerned. The other reason for being very concerned, apart from it being very infectious, is it is also vaccine bypassing. So it's not totally vaccine bypassing, but it is significantly vaccine bypassing. What that means is that soup of antibodies that we have made from the vaccines that we have all received is now less effective against something that really wants to infect you. So there are many, many reasons why. My advice number one would be don't get infected. Of course, get your boosters, but don't get infected is an important message too.
And I think I'm going to ask you just to expand on that a little bit, because it's such a simple 3 words, don't get infected. And yet we still see people wandering around without masks on, carrying on life as normal, which is understandable, because we were just discussing earlier, after 2 years, we're bored of this pandemic. But what do we need to do to not get infected?
So one thing is to know how you can get infected and then take measures against that knowledge. So we know that this is a person-to-person spread of infection, and therefore reduce your connections with our fellow human beings. Nothing we can do at the moment, but all we can do is say good times will appear. In the meantime, reduce your connections in especially crowded indoor, poorly ventilated places, those parties where we sing and talk in a loud voice in a noisy environment, anywhere where there's lots of people who may be secreting millions and millions of virus particles, which we would inhale, get infected, and get ill. One way also is to wear a mask, wear a good quality mask. So here, sitting on my desk, Andy, I just happen to have it, is, a mask like this one, a FFP2 mask. It's much better, much tighter fitting. So I say the virus gets more infectious. We up our game with respect to the quality of the mask that we're all wearing.
So it's keeping a balance and just keeping a step ahead. But as well as not getting infected, obviously, just 2 years ago, at the end of the year, we look back, at 2 years ago, we were hearing about this troublesome little thing coming out of China where it's probably just a seasonal flu, which turned out not to be. And then a year ago, we were talking about vaccines coming on stream, and everyone was very excited about getting their first shots in the arms. Now we're talking about boosters and looking to the year ahead. Should people be discouraged by the statistics that are coming out saying that the Omicron, as you just mentioned, Omicron is bypassing vaccines? If they say, well, if it's bypassing, maybe they'll say, well, why bother?
That's a lovely question and an important one to address. So we have what we have nothing else. And what the vaccines do, the booster do, is give you more of those antibodies that are still working. So even if many of your antibodies, in other words, the soup of antibodies, if a proportion of it is now ineffective, we've still got another proportion that is still effective. And if we have more of it via the boosters, then it will neutralize the virus and keep you safe. But a better strategy is never to have the virus in the first instance. And looking at these things now, Andy, I begin to think that we may even need to reformulate the vaccines that we have to mirror the spike protein on Omicron, so that we have appropriate antibodies to tackle the Omicron spike protein come the new year.
I think we must add into that it's incredible, almost literally incredible, that the vaccine was, that came out almost a year ago, the vaccines that started to roll out, that they were put together within and tested within a year. And this is a miracle of science that we really mustn't underestimate. In the year that's passed, I'm certain that the researchers have been carrying on full tilt and understand even more now about the virus. So do you think that we'll see different ways of tackling the coronavirus, maybe in a way that's a little bit more generic and will knock out a part of the virus that can't variate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one thing that we must do is suppress infections, and we've spoken about this a lot, i.e. immunize Africa and other poorer parts of the world. The second thing that is now also going to become mainstream is medication that you take early on in your infection. And we have at least two very good contenders. One of them is a nucleoside analog. That nucleoside analog basically makes the virus make lots and lots and lots of mistakes because it has been tricked into accepting this medication, thinking it's part of its RNA makeup.
Right.
And it makes so many mistakes, it self-destructs. The other medication is an antiviral. Viruses need enzymes to put it all together and become an effective, viable virus. So if we have medicines that destroy these enzymes and it stops them working properly, that's also a good therapeutic. So we are getting pills that are coming on the market which are working from Pfizer, from Merck, and from other pharmaceutical companies. And the trouble with that is it has to be taken very earlier on in your infection. But overall, it is good news that we've got better understanding. It is aerosol spread. Vaccines do work. We can reformulate the vaccines. And we've now got brands of antivirals like the enzyme denaturing one or a nucleoside analog. And we've also got monoclonal antibodies that we can also produce. So there's lots of good news. We mustn't despair.
Well, it's very exciting to hear this armory of tools that are being leveled up against this evil virus. And I look forward to speaking with you in the new year about how this is really moving things on. Now, this time of year, when we were kids, we used to sing, all we want for Christmas is our two front teeth. Now I think all we want for Christmas is for the virus to go away. Dr. Bharat Pankhania, thank you so much for joining us here again today on The Edge and for all your expertise this year. Thank you. England's chief medical officer says that the Omicron variant could rise incredibly fast, but its peak should subside quickly due to boosters. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's urged people to use caution in the face of the variant. However, Johnson insisted England was not being put into lockdown by stealth after some of his own MPs accused the government of putting hospitality under an effective lockdown. We'll continue to closely follow the developments regarding the Omicron variant. For now, let's move on to our next topic to speak about the United Nations' alarming report about food insecurity in the Arab world. This newly released UN report says that nearly 70 million people suffered from malnutrition in the Arab world last year. Our following infographic has more facts. A report by the United Nations has shown that nearly 70 million people face malnutrition in the Arab world due to various political and environmental crises.
A third of people in the 420 million strong Arab world do not have enough to eat, the UN said on Thursday, highlighting that 69 million suffered from malnutrition over the last year. In a new report, the World Body's Food and Agricultural Organization said that between 2019 and 2020, the number of malnourished in the Arab world rose by 4.8 million people to 69 million, nearly 16% of the population. Adding that nearly 141 million people did not have access to adequate food in 2020, an increase of more than 10 million people since 2019. Conflict hit Somalia and Yemen remain the worst affected countries last year, with nearly 60% of Somalians going hungry and more than 45% of Yemenis. The FOA said hunger had increased by 91.1% in the Arab world over the past 2 decades.
And I'm joined from Beirut in Lebanon by Dr. Tariq Chindeb, who's a lawyer and professor in international law and international relations. Dr. Chindeb, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge.
Thank you.
It's an alarming figure that a third of people living in the Arab world are hungry. They don't have enough food to eat. We've just been hearing about the United Nations report on this. Well, what's your reaction to that?
Actually, it is a shocking report, but this report doesn't give the all information and all reason about this result. Actually, as I said, it shocked me actually. But if we look in the Middle East and what happened in the Arab world, we know that that is the result we can expect. The world now is a village. The Arab world is very small countries between this big world and the war in Syria and Iraq and in Yemen is doing a big role in increase the number of people who are now suffering from poverty and malnutrition. So for this reason, we have to know the exactly situations. We have to know the exactly reason what this number is growing up to this level.
as you mentioned, there are several conflicts going on, particularly we're heartbroken by the scenes that we see from Yemen with the terrible, terrible scenes of malnutrition from there, as well as the trauma that's been inflicted on the citizens of Syria. And these two situations are conflict-driven. What needs to be done to move on from there? Because in both of these situations, there are several countries that aren't immediately involved in, local to the conflict, involved in it. What does the international community need to do to break this cycle, do you think?
Let me first tell you one thing. It's very important. That is the countries, the big countries or big warlords who support the war in Syria, the war in Iraq, the war in Yemen, and they should penalize about that. What are you doing against the Syrian people, against the Syrian Yemeni? And this warlord should pay their fines, and they should pay the price of the war. For example, USA, Russia, and Iran, who support Assad regime to kill people, these countries play the role, the big role, to increase the number of people who are now suffering from poverty and malnutrition. Let me tell you another thing. The war has contributed a lot of increased poverty and hunger in the Middle East and the rest of the world, because the world now has become global village and very small village. And this war in Yemen and Syria is a big infection in what happened in Arab world. And despite the war, we have to know that what happened in the last 2 years, the main reason is to the COVID-19 and the other issues, but it is not like the big reason to this poverty and this malnutrition. The international community, the UN, has to play their big role to stop the war, to take the warlord to the International Criminal Court, and to stop this criminal. And when we stop these crimes against people in Syria, in Yemen, and when we stop killing, or when we stop crime against people in Iraq, I think the number will go down and see a new situation in Arab world. But actually now, we have to say that the International Criminal Court should play a big role in this issue. The UN Secretary General, the UN, and the big countries in the world should pay and refund and fundraise to these people, because they are the reason of this war. They support the criminal regime to kill their people. And I think all we do and all we need to know that the main reason of this poverty is the war.
Absolutely. And where criminal acts, crimes against humanity have been committed, I totally agree with you that those who perpetrated these definitely need to be brought to account, and too often they're able to get off scot-free. Now, we're talking to you from Beirut in Lebanon, where there's a very different situation. It's not conflict-driven, it's a politically driven situation. Today, UNICEF has published a report saying that, I just heard a little earlier, that 80% of children are hungry in Lebanon. What about the situation there? What needs to be done to help them?
I think the situation in Lebanon is very, very bad. It is not different than the other situation, because we have to know that we are in Lebanon, we have lots of migrants, lots of refugees, and lots of corruptions. and especially after the explosion of the blast in Beirut last year. Thousands of children going hungry a year after Beirut blast. That is what Al Jazeera report. And other report say 1 year after Beirut blast, half of Lebanon population lives in poverty. And the situation is catastrophic for Lebanese children and for refugee and migrant. Lebanon children at risk of acute hunger. The RSL time said it is the situation in Beirut. What we have in Beirut now in Lebanon, it is very, very bad situation. It is catastrophic situation. About 80% of Lebanon is going to be very poor people this year. The dollar now is going up against the Lebanese lira, and the Lebanese lose about 80% from their value. Now, what are you talking about? The reason? I know the COVID-19 is one of the reasons, but the main reason is the corruption. The corruption in Lebanon is the main reason about what happened in Lebanon. Until now, no one judge or no one sue any one of these person who stole the money of the Lebanese and who stole everything in Lebanon. And that is what happened in Lebanon. People is going to be more poor and more poverty.
We've seen things going day to day going worse in Lebanon, and the situation is sort of upsetting because it's a situation which should be able to pull itself around if the leadership of the country did the right thing. We saw just after the Beirut port explosion figures like Emmanuel Macron coming in and making a passing effort to find a solution and then losing interest. Obviously, Lebanon doesn't just need passing interest; it needs real support to rebuild itself, to find its own focus and find a solution from within, I suspect. What can the international community do to help Lebanon to reach that point?
I think it's very important questions about what can the international community doing. The international community can enforce to the law, the international law, the 1559 resolution UN and the 1701 resolution. If the international community on the UN make sure about make the law, the international law is the main issue in Lebanon. Yani the number 1701 resolution UN and the 1559 UN resolution, it's the main issue in the main agenda to build the new Lebanon. To build Lebanon under law, under constitution, without militia, without drugs cartels, without corruption, politics people. And let me tell you one thing, that Macron, the French president, came to Lebanon after the explosion twice time, and he came to support Hezbollah militia. And to stop to stop the people revolution against the politics system in Lebanon. And that is what happened when Macron came, and he supported the last government, which do nothing for Lebanese people. And we still have the same problem, the corruption. The militia is doing what they want. There is no law, no constitution, and the militia is the main issue or the main party in Lebanon who focus and who are doing what they want without the law, without any system political system, and that is the main problem. The UN should doing their best with the other Lebanese friend to make the Lebanese people come again to their life by helping him to focus on respect the law, respect the international law, and the main issue is the UN resolution 1701 and 1559.
Absolutely.
If the 1559 and the 1701 established in Lebanon, all the problem will finish in Lebanon.
It looks very much about whether in Lebanon or whether in the case of the conflict-ridden countries like Syria and Yemen that we discussed earlier, it looks like if the international community upholds international law and upholds international human rights, then all these problems should be resolved. But we need that momentum. We need them to act honestly and to make that happen. Dr. Tariq Chineb, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge. It's been fascinating speaking with you. Thank you. Conflicts continue to be one of the leading causes of hunger in the region, with approximately 53.4 million people facing hunger in countries and areas affected by conflict, which is more than 6 times higher than in non-conflict countries. We sincerely hope that conflicts will end as soon as possible to bring an end to the humanitarian crises. And now, let's move on to our final topic to speak about rising Islamophobia in Europe. Islamophobia is the rising problem of this century, with false assumptions fueling the crisis. Our following infographic has more. Islamophobic incidents have become a daily fact of life for Muslim communities across Europe. Critics say the double standards applied to Muslims and Islamic norms are increasingly being enforced by legislation.
The double standards of Western states have directly contributed to the rise of Islamophobia to alarming degrees. In European countries, while anti-Semitism is considered a crime, insulting Islam is allowed under the guise of freedom of expression. Experts call for a distinction between freedom of expression and hate speech against all religions, including Islam. Amir Musa, a former Arab League Secretary General, urged constitutional and legal institutions in countries where Muslims are exposed to discrimination, maltreatment and double standards to immediately fight against injustice and criminalize insulting Islamic religion and values. Ali Bakir, a Lebanese researcher and journalist, says that in the West, and especially in France, there are double standards when it comes to Muslims. Bakir added that any criticism against Israel was considered anti-Semitism and not seen within the prism of freedom of expression, adding that such laws would prevent the rise of Islamophobia in Europe and prevent politicians from using this issue as an election material. He concluded by adding that such laws would prevent the rise of Islamophobia in Europe and prevent politicians from using the issue as election material.
And I'm joined from Birmingham in England by Professor Francis Davis, who's a Professor of Religion and Public Policy at the University of Birmingham. Professor Davis, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge. Francis, I want to ask you, just recently in the US House of Representatives, Ilhan Omar said that Islamophobia is global in scope and we must lead the global effort to address it. Islamophobia is something that we've been seeing too many signs of, both in America and across Europe, with attacks on mosques, attacks on individuals. How do you characterize the current situation?
I think in the West it's become the last respectable prejudice. And that works its way out explicitly in attacks from the far right and from those frightened about things that are not actually real. And then it works its way out in a kind of a polite ignorance. So we're not training our diplomats to be religiously literate. So when they engage with Muslim communities, they don't really know how to engage properly. We're not training our policymakers in how to engage with diverse communities adequately enough, which means that they don't notice how their policies can accidentally discriminate. And then I think, as your commentary said, that we have standards for the Muslim community which are higher than those applied to all sorts of other communities, which make the Muslim community more vulnerable of attack.
And it's actually this discrepancy which is having a tremendous effect in places like France, where under the guise of laicity, it's identity coupled with identity politics. The far right is particularly using it as a weapon coming up into the current elections.
Yeah, the European Commission has recognised that there are structural discriminations against the Muslim community, both in terms of the way that speech is used, in terms of media images, and structurally in terms of access to employment and education opportunities across the European Union. So they appointed a full-time coordinator to be able to address discrimination against Muslims in the EU. But some member states, and France and Denmark and Austria at times are leading this charge, want to opt out of that shared European position and invent an alternative position. And in France, the right have started to attack Muslims who tend to be in urban areas that never vote for the right, as a way of scaring rural voters and suburban voters to go out and vote for them. And Monsieur Macron and others have responded by trying to kind of out-Islam or mistreat the Muslim community with a mind to capturing some share of that vote. And so it is a French problem, but actually it then becomes a European problem, because if the shared position of Europe is that there should be equal rights with equal treatment before the law, you can't have one member state, whether that's Austria, France, Denmark or others, then picking an alternative path which makes it unsafe. There are 20 million Muslims in Europe. That's as many as there are in some member states' citizens, and it's not good enough to let one or other member state or one or other geographical area kind of peel off from what the supposed shared position is supposed to be.
You've made several very important comments there, and one of the things that just struck me was the idea of training diplomats and changing perceptions. And whilst you were just talking, I was thinking of Prime Minister Ardern in New Zealand, leading by example after the mosque attacks that happened just over a year or so ago in New Zealand, and how the way that she handled that by wearing a headscarf and showing respect to the Muslim community had a very different effect on the dialogue.
It had an electric effect. She refused to use the name of the perpetrator of the racist attacks on the mosques. She covered her head. She attended Jummah prayers, I understand, like externally outside the mosque, simply to be alongside those who were inside, and she went out of her way to connect to those communities. And there are other examples of politicians like this. A former Secretary of State in the UK, John Denham, would regularly choose to go and visit his mosque simply to send the message that it's acceptable. There are open mosque days in the UK that ministers will proactively, along with fire and police and others, make a point of attending. And the reverse of the Ardennes model, if you want to call it that, are those that have no Muslim friends, have no connections with Muslim institutions, and then scaremonger about the quality of Muslim philanthropy or where donations from zakat will end up. So she was a hero. There are other heroes rising up now, New Muslim and Brown and sympathetic members of Congress in the US, but their voices are under pressure from even within their own parties on the left. They're under pressure. And that's a concern. So New Zealand, big tick. America, Britain, parts of Europe could do better.
Indeed. Well, as we're coming to the end of the year, as well as looking at the very terrible realities of this prejudice and this ignorance that is shown through the prejudice, there are other examples, of course, of communities that are coming together and working together. How important is it, and I think I know your answer to this, but how important is it that bridges are made within communities across different segments of society?
Well, I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. And let me just give you a few examples which have excited me recently. So in the new year, I'm going to be moving to a new university, the University of Roehampton. And that university, half of its students, half of those students are black and minority ethnic students. 30% of the students there are Muslims and 60% are women. So that's kind of like a laboratory for the social progress that we need to see in a great city like London. Mm-hmm. And there are other examples of this. There's Ibu Patel in Chicago, who brings people together from the Jewish and the Muslim and the Christian communities. And what they talk about is their common concerns on poverty, and they launch social enterprises together to address the needs at the bottom of the economic pyramid in Chicago. And then in the UK, in Bradford, and in the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi diaspora, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, has an initiative called Near Neighbours that spends time bringing women together to cook cakes. In Paris, I have a friend, he brings women together to discuss Miriam, the only woman mentioned in the Holy Quran, who is also mentioned in the Bible. So there are lots of places and topics and themes and spaces that we can build. And it seems to me that as we think about someone who was born in Palestine, right, in Bethlehem, next door to all of those communities, yes. And who became a prophet and a person respected by the major world religions, which is what Christmas is about. There's lots of reasons to think that we should be full of hope at this time of year and to be excited for what could be achieved in the new year if some of the crazies can be kept in order by legislation, by decent policy and by new training.
Well, as a message at the end of 2021, Francis, I hope that many will take that on board, and as they're thinking about how they want to change themselves into 2022, that they'll use some of those ideas to think about how they can open their arms to their neighbours and get to know them better. Professor Francis Davies, thank you so much for joining us, and all the best in your new venture at the beginning of next year. Thank you. Our authorities say that if the West were honest, instead of undermining Muslims on the pretext of freedom of expression, they would act consistently and enact laws to protect them by defending the same freedom against all religions and beliefs. Such laws would prevent the rise of Islamophobia in Europe and prevent politicians from using this issue as election material. We hope that the necessary measures will be taken to ensure the safety of everyone. Now, our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. And that brings us nearly to the end of this second season of The Edge. But before closing today's programme, here's a brief reminder of the guests and analysts from all over the world who've given their perspectives from beyond the edge. I particularly want to thank them for their expert insights. So here's a special video of the day, which is a short overview of our second season. American troops withdrew from Afghanistan in haste without elaborating clear plans or objectives after their withdrawal. Has now left the Taliban with access to $85 billion worth of American weapons and equipment. Can you describe to us what is the feeling? Is this the calm following the storm?
Yes, good evening, Andy from Afghanistan, from the capital, Kabul. Yes, today is a different day for all Afghan people. Taliban this morning, early morning, described the day of today as a victory day, and it says that and claiming that this is not just a victory of Taliban, this is a victory of Afghan people.
When we travel, we use, by the way, this is also another document. This is our passport. It's not a passport, it's actually a travel document. Right. It have the Lebanese flag here. So when we go to airports, they ask us, "You are Lebanese?" We tell them, "No, we are not Lebanese, we are Palestinians." So why there's the Lebanese flag here? Because the Lebanon authorities issued this.
Further integration between Facebook and WhatsApp and how that data may be used in terms of your interests and how you're using the service. So I think it kind of it is a first step in the process, and I think we may see a few more things come up from the EU about how Facebook is, and WhatsApp in particular, is sharing.
There is no other alliance in the region between Arabs and Turks similar to the one that exists today between Qatar and Turkey.
And here's what you've been saying about the 2021 German election on Twitter. Laura Jung says 2 more days until the German election 2021. What's in for climate and health? German health professionals calling for change. And let's now take a look at our video of the day, which explains the engineering that keeps the Parker Solar Probe cooled during its mission. I'm now joined live from New York, from the edge of the UN General Assembly, by A News broadcast coordinator Orhan Salih. And so that wraps up today's edition of The Edge. And as Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says in his book, it's neither moral nor fair for just 5 nations to make decisions on issues that could influence the fate of the world. The world is bigger than 5. And that's all from this episode and this season of The Edge with me, Andy BOYNS. Stay tuned as we'll be back in the new year with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.